education in our community and beyond. Currently, the National Institute for Resilience is in 41 states and 7 countries, including the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, the Philippines, Germany, India, and the United States. We partner with NIHR to reach people in our community, education professionals, members of the health professions, leaders, and coming soon, first responders. But today we're focusing specifically on the education sector. And now I'm delighted to turn it over to Chip, who will tell you more about GRIT-4ED.
Thank you, Dean Connolly. I very much appreciate your introduction and all that the College of Education has done and is doing for the K through 12 sector, and just the leadership that's been shown around how we can all work together to get through the pandemic. It's clear to me that the isolation and the challenges that school systems have faced throughout the state and throughout the country to try to manage an unprecedented experience where we've had to think through moving things online, off online, and think about sports, think about families, think about food. I mean, there's been so many angles on this for our educational system, and I think teachers and administrators have done an amazing job and continue to work tirelessly in this effort. And I think a lot of energy and focus has been, and rightly so, on healthcare workers, the frontline workers from that perspective, and also first responders, EMTs, and fire and so forth, police. But really, the teachers and the school systems are the front lines. And I did some work after Hurricane Katrina many, many years ago with the school system down there in the St. Bernard Parish. And I was firsthand aware there of how critical the education system is to the community resilience, really, in terms of responding and recovering from major disasters, and this is no different. So I'd like to talk tonight about the GRIT program and what it really is about, where it came from, and give some underpinnings to that. And then we'll see a short video, which is actually some aspects of the training itself that is free for anybody who is interested in education and trying to create a resilient and robust response and support for your colleagues, for your students, for the families. That's what the training's about, and I'll get into that in a little bit. But the video is 25 minutes, and it really is a segment of the actual training to give people a real sense of the meat of the training itself, or at least setting that up. It's a 5-hour training program that's free to anybody, and we'll talk about it later about how to get to it, but it's available. You can just go to grit.uccs.edu and click on the box that's focused on education. So it's very simple to go there and sign up. So let me talk a little bit about the concepts and why GRIT. So GRIT stands for Greater Resilience Information Toolkit, and it really was born in my experience with disaster mental health and disaster research that I've been involved with for many, many years. And when the pandemic struck, it really hit me that this was going to affect everyone. Typically, disasters are localized; they're very specific. The fire, the floods, the earthquakes, and so forth. We really can wrap around the population that's been directly affected. 9/11 was probably one of our most interesting with that the reverberations across the country were profound. So that was a bigger experience for us to absorb, but in some ways. Then this, though, I was realizing pretty quickly, this is going to affect everybody. And so one of the things that the research tells us is that a sense of capability to manage the trauma, to manage the disaster, is a very large predictor of how people do. So strength, resilience, the capacity, the feeling that you can manage what's happening to you. And so that, combined with another variable that we know is super important, which is social support, I thought, well, we got to marry these things up. And one of the ways to do that is to think about training up people to use some very basic skills on supporting other people's coping capacity, their coping strategies around strength, around health, you know, management of self-care, those kinds of factors. We can train people to do that very simply and very specifically, and then also give them resources to offer to people. So if somebody they're talking to is struggling, we can give them resources. Like there's an online platform that I developed with colleagues many years ago, and we adapted it for COVID called myresiliencehelp.com. And it's free and available and it's out there. And we have a version in Spanish as well. And, you know, when you're talking to a family or to a colleague in a school system, these are the kinds of resources that we can offer to people, along with telephonic and the work that Dr. Steve Berkowitz, who's on the panel tonight, has been doing up at Anschutz and so forth. So we have a lot of options to offer people. So the training was really designed as a way to get people support and teach them how to reach out to their loved ones and their social networks, and in the case of schools, to the colleagues and families that are interrelated to the school experience. So in early spring, after we developed the initial community-based GRIT program, which for those of you who are on the town hall tonight, please, you can definitely share that community training for other people who aren't involved in the school system, but are just friends and loved ones that you think could benefit from the training. There is that community-based training. But then I was working with Dr. Carolyn Geary, who's been involved in administration of schools and trauma-based education. And she and Nicole Weiss and I started thinking, we've got to do something for the schools, because they're going to hit this pretty hard, pretty quick. And so we put together a training, and I think it was in late May or mid-May. And then we redid that training in the fall of this year because we knew we were in a different zone for the school systems at that point, and the sort of startup of going back into the schools and doing it in person, and then again, sort of being able to go remote. And we're kind of in that similar dance right now, if you will. So that was the original idea then, was to work with some professionals like Dr. Geary and Nicole Weiss to think about, let's put together this training for schools and for the educators, teachers, administrators, coaches, and so forth, where they can then gain these skills and be able to work together to create teams that could then help kids and their families in the response to the pandemic, as well as for helping each other. So that was the foundation for the GRIT concepts. And what I'd like to do now is shift and show the video that will give you a taste of what the training is about. So I think, Jared, if you could put that up at this point, that would be great.
All right, so welcome to the GRIT Resilience Coach Program for Education. GRIT-4ED is our acronym for that. GRIT stands for Greater Resiliency Intervention Teams, and we're going to get into all of the good stuff of what that means and what we hope this program can provide to you. My name is Nicole Weiss. I am a clinical therapist and peer support program manager for the National Institute for Human Resilience. I do a couple of different things on the side as well, and I've been running the GRIT program since we started it in March of this year. Seems like years ago at this point. Carolyn?
And I'm Carolyn Geary, and I teach in the Bachelor of Innovation program at UCCS. And I've been working with the GRIT program through the National Institute for Human Resilience with Nicole. And we started this work last spring.
Like I said, feels like years ago now at this point.
It does.
So it felt like a good time to revamp this training, do a little bit of new information and education. We've learned a lot in the last several months, and we wanted to provide some hopefully new and fun education to go along with this new updated training. So what is the GRIT Resilience Coach Program? If you have not been in this program before, GRIT was established to train volunteers in our community to promote wellness and resilience support to fellow community members, whether that be friends, family, acquaintances. In the education world, that could be students, your coworkers, your education community, your sports community, if you're coming from a sports background as well. And it was really launched because of COVID-19, and knowing that when it really started coming across our own country and new regulations started to be implanting and a lot of fear really started rising up, we and the Institute really wanted to provide something to provide some simple education, but really some really skills-based tools for people to use to reach out and make really healthy and meaningful connections to each other. And by doing so, you not only check in with your loved ones, but also hopefully provide some really helpful resources. And when we do that, we really build resilience and that community efficacy within each other. So that while this was launched in response to COVID, it is certainly not segregated to COVID. There is opportunity to use these GRIT skills and information you're going to learn in many, many aspects of your life. And unfortunately, we live in the world where we will have more disasters that come our way. We will unfortunately have more stress and trauma. And the more and more we reach out and connect as a community and provide these really helpful resources, the more resilient we become as an entire community. So know that while this was launched in the wake of COVID, it can really be applied to future or other current disasters as well.
So my background also is in education. I'm a former school administrator, school principal, as well as a statewide administrator. And like Nicole was just mentioning, you know, with the GRIT program, while it's in response to COVID, as we know, there have been different events that have impacted our community in the past. And GRIT really draws upon, you know, our strengths and our sense of efficacy and how we can support each other within our various communities. So when we talk about the school community, you know, we're talking about all of the members of that community, the students, the staff, the athletic coaches that work with students within that school environment. It's everybody that's connected within that whole network. And so the GRIT Resilience program, I'm going to really emphasize the word resilience because that is what we're drawing upon as we start to think through this very different landscape that we're finding ourselves in, but then also being able to recognize that there are many things that we've gone through in the past, both collectively as well as individually, that make us stronger. So this is really like the basis of the program. So thinking about the whole community and the power of the whole community, and it's a little bit about, you know, what I just spoke of, because we all have different roles. We come to a school environment often as maybe a teacher or a principal, but then also as a parent and also as a member of, you know, that group of neighborhoods that comprise that school community. So we have, you know, a lot of different perspectives in terms of, you know, how we support our students and each other. And so there's a lot of power in that. And sometimes we tend to forget a little bit about the strength of that network, especially when we're experiencing different levels of stress and challenges. But when you take a step back and you realize, you know, that we are all interconnected, it is reassuring because then we have people that we can rely upon, people that we know, relationships that we built. And so that is what we really want to think about and also leverage, you know, during this time. And it's also going to be a focus of this training as well.
So a couple of quick training logistics, whether you're coming with us live or watching this as a recording. As I said, there will be some self-reflections. There are many self-reflections throughout your workbook that we encourage you to fill out as you go through the workbook on your own. It really helps hopefully connect you into the training, but also give yourself some examples and feedback to really apply this information into your own world. And throughout the training, there'll be some self-reflections that we ask to give us feedback if you have any. Carolyn and I will share our own. And if you're watching this as a recording, just fill it out in your workbook as you go along. There will also be opportunities afterwards to practice the skills you're going to learn in this week or throughout these modules. So when you have opportunity to practice, really give that a go. And I know that kind of sounds awkward. We're practicing how to have a conversation. I know how to have a conversation, right? but it's different because we're using some very specific skills within these conversations. So if you're watching this as a recording, pause, give yourself some time to practice. If you're coming at us live, maybe take some time after the training to practice with somebody, whether that's somebody in your house, you call a friend, whatever that might look like. But really practice the skills that we're giving you, because it really works on some of that muscle memory. And so it helps these conversations come out more natural. There is a quiz at the end of training if you would like to complete it. If you complete it and pass it, you can then receive a certificate of completion. And if you would like that personalized, you can absolutely just email us at grit@uccs.edu or reply to the emails that I've sent you. And I'm happy to personalize that. You just have to let me know which grit training you completed and which date you completed it on. There's also a feedback survey that you can also take to just give us some basic feedback on how the training went for you. If you have any questions that we didn't get to answer or any suggestions for us, we're always very open to that. And then finally, there is a weekly survey that we send out every Friday with a reminder every Monday. It's a very quick survey. Even if you don't have time to fill all of it out, we basically just ask how many contacts you're making using your grit skills, what kinds of contacts those were, and what resources you shared. And then it again gives you opportunity to leave any questions or feedback for us. And I do monitor that to make sure that we address those as much as possible. And this just helps us track, again, how many kind of connections we are making within the grit coaching world. So it's helpful for us. It just takes a few minutes. And even if you don't have a few minutes, you can just put in the number of contacts you made pretty quick and easy. So once again, kind of talking more about the Grit Resilience Coach program. We created this because the current pandemic can be viewed as a disaster to our community, the country, and really the world at this point. In times of disaster, strengthening, coping, spreading support, and providing resources can and will have a positive impact on healing and resilience for everybody, which was really the purpose of the GRIT program. As a GRIT coach, you can help strengthen resilience and spread this support through the relationships you have in your own school community or your community where you live. This GRIT program was really emphasized on your natural connections, right? And so as an educator, you already have some really beautiful connections with students, with coworkers and other educators in your field, and having some extra skills to reach out and say, how are you? But really, how are you, right? Not just having that answer of, oh, things are stressful, but I'm fine. And we'll talk about all of this, but again, really digging deeper. How are you sleeping though? How are you eating? What can the world do to kind of support you? And here are some resources that might help. So that's the core of this program, is really to strengthen those natural connections that you already have and provide some more skills and resources to make those really meaningful.
So some of the language that we're using, of course, there's the GRIT program and being a GRIT coach, and we're going to explore those more fully. But there's also this concept of 3 around me. And I like to think of this as a 3-legged stool. Like if you take one of the legs off, it's just gonna fall, right? Especially if you sit on it, which is not a great idea. But if you have those 3 legs, then it's very, very stable. When you think about a student, when you think about a colleague, when you think about somebody who's connected to our community, if you could think of each and every one of those individuals as having a network of 3 to support them, then that chance for stability is much greater. When I think about this in the context of a school community, and I think about the students, and especially those students who are the most vulnerable, and the families who are also the most vulnerable. If we can visualize that around every student, around every family, there are 3 who are supporting them, then the chances for them to really be able to succeed and be able to really touch into that sense of their own efficacy is also much greater. And so when we go through this training, I'd like you to think in the back of your head, like, who are those individuals within your own community that you have a strong connection to, that you can start to work with to provide that support around students, around colleagues, around student athletes, for example. Because that way, because we're all human, there are times when we've got this, and there are times when just life gets the better, right? It's one up on us. And if you have those other people that are part of your team, then that student, that family, that colleague, that other coach, they're going to be okay because you know somebody will be there to support them. So we're going to talk a lot about 3 Around Me and how this functions, not just in the environment that we're currently in, but also during any time in our lives when we either need some more support or we recognize that somebody who we are connected to really needs that additional support. So, 3 Around Me, who can be a part of this team? So when I think about the school community, I also think about how we all have different kinds of connections with our students and with our families. For example, a student's day starts in the morning and they perhaps are taking the bus. And so the first adult that they're going to have an interaction with as part of that community is the bus driver, who has a very unique relationship with the student. Also, during the course of their day, they're going to have lots of varied interactions, right? Not only with their teachers, like their homeroom teacher, but also with office personnel, in the cafeteria, for example. If they're part of a sport after school, they may engage with that sport. They also may be out in the community where they're engaging with a different sport within that community. And so their day is incredibly varied. Those kinds of interactions are varied. And so during the course of that time, they're going to have a lot of opportunities for different levels of support. With that being said, everybody that's connected to each other, you have a different kind of relationship. Sometimes that relationship, you've known that student over multiple years, especially if they're involved with a sport, for example, or perhaps that, they're your homeroom student, they're in an elementary class, and so you see them a lot, which is different than when they're in high school, for example. And so every adult has a different way to connect, and we also have different ways that we're connecting with each other. So who is a part of that team? It's 3 individuals, and you're looking at a group that you're going to provide support with and for, but that group doesn't have to be the same. It doesn't have to be 3 teachers that all teach the 3rd grade. It doesn't have to be 3 lacrosse coaches. It doesn't have to be, you get the idea, right? And so the more varied it is, the more opportunity that exists in order to, like, 1, notice when somebody's not doing well, but 2, be able to help each other to support, that individual. So do you have to have a team that's all put together now? No. When we're talking about 3 Around Me, it's just starting to think about this idea, and this looks differently for every person and the role that you are in within your environment. And so we're just suggesting that you start to think about this, and you can even start to think about this in your own life as well, because you have your friends, you have your support system that's already there. But then, how do you extend that support system out to really think about it within the context of the community? So as you start to go through this training, you may think about somebody who you're like, yeah, that would be a great addition to this team, and then suggest that they may also want to get this training so that you can share the same language. And Nicole, I don't know if you want to add on to that also.
Yeah, no, I think you covered it really well. I think, again, hopefully the beauty behind GRIT is that it really can be understood by a wide variety of people, and it's really up to you, right? We have some asks after the program in terms of just let us know what kind of contacts you're making, but there's really no real obligation here. This is really just about making more and more connections as a human being, as a community. So you absolutely can share this with anybody. You can have these kind of conversations within your school. You can talk about what this might look like within your own little community, whatever this looks like for you. That's the most important part.
So we've covered quite a bit about what a GRIT resilience team is. When you think about the 3 Around Me concept and you think about it within the framework of a team, then also it is the training that they've received. And so ideally, if you have a 3 around me and all 3 have received the grit resilience training, then that's a really strong team, and you can start to collaborate and think through various challenges that may be impacting your community. This also can relate to an athletic team. It can relate to a small school, a large school, any environment that's connected in this way. And it's a way for you to kind of think outside of how you would normally create an approach when a student is struggling. So this gives you some more resources.
Yeah, and I just want to add to that I think there's so many different types of disasters and really stress that can impact our school communities. But right now, our minds, mostly focused on how COVID is continuing to impact everybody. But there's also been these fires that have swept throughout the country. There's been hurricanes. I mean, there's a lot of natural disasters happening as well. And with that, kids absorb this kind of stress, right? And then there's stress that are going to happen within the school communities as well. And so the more you can create these grit resilience teams around you, the easier it is to get some of that support going in response to disasters.
And I want to add to that too. There is something that I just read related to the fires that are occurring right now on the West Coast. And that is that they were able to maintain those connections with their families within the school environment because they were already doing that through a remote learning environment that was taking place because of the pandemic. So because that was already in place, it was much easier for them to reach out and make sure that everyone was okay. So I know we feel like we have this cascading series of events, but there are some skills and some muscles that we've been able to flex recently that we haven't done like maybe in the past that we can also leverage right now to support each other.
So grit coach, the role of a grit coach is really just to support and motivate another person who might be struggling with any kind of level of stress or disaster. We think about this role very similar to coaches we're already familiar with, like sports coaches and life coaches. The best comparison we have for this too is, in that sports world, if you're playing soccer, like these adorable kids are, you're playing soccer and you roll your knee and that hurts, and the coach might pull you and say, okay, well, let's stretch it out a little bit. Let's ice it. Let's talk about it. And then you're walking away and you're still limping pretty hard. And the coach says, hey, maybe we need to go check with the doctor now, right? That's the big difference, is a coach is there to really support you, to give you some really tangible skills, to really motivate you to get through some of the stress you're experiencing, and know that they are not there to fix your ankle, right? And so we can support stress and we can provide resources and coping without necessarily taking on the role of a medical or mental health professional, which is not the role we ask you to take on. So think of that about grit coaching in that similar mindset as well. You're here to motivate and encourage. And in doing so, again, we can make some really wonderful connections. So that leads us to the first pause for self-reflection here. So if you're watching this as a recording, go ahead and pause here literally and fill out a self-reflection on page 4. If you're joining us live, same thing, page 4. What types of qualities make up a good coach? And feel free to share those with us in the chat box. I know for me, it was somebody who really pushed me and didn't let me have those days where I just wanted to sit on the bench and not participate. I was never much of like a big team player, but a good coach would come and sit next to me and say, okay, how do we still get you in the game despite you not really wanting to be in it right now? And that was kind of what I needed some of those days. So it was somebody who noticed where I was struggling and really motivated me the right way to get me back in the game. Carolyn, what about you? What kind of qualities make up a good coach for you?
When I think about this, I also think about my colleagues that have noticed on those days when I thought that I really had it, but in actuality, I didn't. That burnt toast morning got the better of me. And so that coaching piece, again, it was like checking in on me to say, hey, are things okay? Is there anything I can do to help you out today? And you don't always have to have it. I think that's been the best kind of coaching that I've received also.
Absolutely. And we have a participant here saying, I think good communication is important for a good coach. Absolutely. We're going to talk a little bit about how to have some good conversations and what makes that good communication. And so you can take some of those skills with you as well. Somebody else says here is a good listener. Absolutely agree. I think just as much as being a good verbal communicator, you have to be just as good of a listener. And listening is actually a pretty distinct skill that we don't always learn how to develop, but being an active participating listener is actually really powerful as well. Somebody else says willing to run along with me and encourage as we go. Absolutely. And we're going to talk about that too, is how do you kind of walk the walk yourself, right? If I'm going to encourage somebody's having good sleep behavior and good healthy eating and sleep and drinking, right? What am I doing myself in order to encourage those behaviors in myself as well? And when we do that, when we check in with ourselves, that's how we kind of run alongside each other in terms of building resilience and support. So thank you for sharing. Okay, so we will get into some very concrete GRIT steps in just a few moments, but really what we're looking for is how to help everybody is by identifying, which might be students and families who are already struggling. Again, while this is really structured in the school community right now or the education community, this can also be your own natural support network as well. So it might be identifying family or neighbors who also might be struggling a little bit. Assessing, checking in with them, collecting some information. Again, it's that question of how are you, but really how are you? So we collect some information. We want to connect to resources and in that way kind of help stabilize the situation. Support and work on planning some next steps. And if it's in your wheelhouse to do so, monitor and create a plan. So if these are students that you work with, athletes that you see on a regular basis, monitoring and checking in to see how their stress is continuing and if any of the resources or coping is helping or not. And maybe we just need to switch it up at that point. There's nobody in specific of who to help, but what we're looking for is identifying students and families who might be especially in need of coping support during this kinds of disaster, whether it's COVID-19 or any of the current stress we're experiencing right now. The focus is simply on helping members of our community.
So really thinking about, helping students, and something to note is that, and compared to adults, I mean, when you read this, it totally makes sense, right? Because we've had as adults many opportunities to really, confront various challenges and figure out like ways that we can figure those challenges out, who we need to rely upon, how to find resources. But children haven't had, that range of experience yet. And so during difficult times, when they are confronted with challenges, they are very, very vulnerable. And also this can cause higher levels of stress and also trauma that can definitely interrupt and impact their lives in sometimes very profound ways. And so it is one of the things that is concerning at this point in time is we want to make sure that there are ways that we can mitigate that, ways that we can soften that and really, have them start to think about how they do have a lot of strengths. They do have ways in which they can cope during these times. But as I say that, it's something that we definitely need to be tuned into as well.
Absolutely agree with that. I have a friend who's a therapist for children, and she always describes them as they are children, but they're also tiny humans, right? They also have these really profound thoughts and feelings and are able to walk through some of the stress. We just have to guide them. So I've always kind of liked that terminology too. Tiny humans, these are real people we're helping.
So welcome back, everyone. I hope you found the video an informative teaser and wonderful introduction to GRIT-4ED. We're now going to move into the panel portion of this evening's Education Town Hall. And I'd like to start by introducing our panelists. So Dr. Chip Benight will be joined by Dr. Carolyn Geary, Research Affiliate, and Ms. Nicole Weiss, Peer Support Program Manager and Clinician at the Institute. Also joining us is Dr. Steve Berkowitz, MD, who's Professor of Psychiatry at CU's Anschutz School of Medicine. Welcome and thank you, panelists, for joining us this evening. I do hope that we're going to have a dialogue around some of the issues that are both challenges and some silver linings, as we've come to call them, in the education community in response to what's been going on with the pandemic. I would like to start out with you, Dr. Berkowitz. If you could share a little bit about some of the things that you've been involved in at CU Anschutz, what some of the initiatives have been that you've undertaken, and what you've been seeing in the education community in response.
I thank you. Though background, we started with a support and a text line for healthcare providers on March 22nd of 2020. It expanded at the state's request to go statewide, and we also have been offering basically an 8-session series called Past the Pandemic, as well as support groups for healthcare providers, either units, teams, practices, and we've done about 400 groups since June of 2020. With the call line, we recognized that we were starting to get some inquiries from teachers. And yeah, we were kind of surprised by that because it was really billed as a healthcare line. And we opened it up in November to teachers. We went from 2 to 3 calls a day to about 15 to 16, with the vast majority being educators. Primarily teachers, some principals, some administrators. Now, it's obviously a bias. People who are reaching out are generally struggling. About 10% of the calls from teachers have resulted in referrals to treatment. But I thought maybe it would be useful just to share a couple of the themes that have been universal. First, everybody feels overwhelmed. They don't know how to do some of the extra work that they need to deal with, because of the virtual world, the going back and forth to, from virtual to in-person to some hybrid creates all sorts of issues. And so that's been a real concern. The other piece that has come up a great deal is a feeling among teachers that they're incompetent, that they don't know how to teach well in this setting, and engaging the kids and parents effectively. And inordinate number, we about 40 to 50% are questioning whether they need to find another career. So I think, the stress on teachers is probably as profound as it is on healthcare workers. And that we really need to think about how we can do a better job of supporting the frontline teachers on a regular basis. So hopefully this is the beginning to doing that.
I'm so pleased to hear you acknowledge how difficult it has been for our teachers to, the word of the year, pivot, in being able to provide instruction to children in these different settings. It is certainly true that our school settings are very diverse, and the students that our schools serve are diverse, and that we have seen different reactions to the pandemic depending upon, some of our schools haven't been remote at all. In the rural areas, they've been in person the entire time, while other schools have been in person, gone remote, come back in person, gone remote again. So there have been some schools that have really had to react in very quick time to different instructional modalities. Dr. Geary, I'd like to bring you into the conversation now and ask if you could speak a little bit about some of the observations you've made about the different impact on different people in different roles and in different settings.
Yes, and so, you know, within like what you were speaking to, within the educational community, the impact has definitely been varied and at different times, right? And so while one school may be doing okay and there's minimal impact, perhaps like further down the road, you know, they're really experiencing, you know, just the effect within that community. So, you know, the school is definitely embedded within the community and draws its strength from that community, as well as gives back to the community. And so it's inseparable that way. So I think that's a really good point to make. Within the training, we do really concentrate on this concept of having a sense of efficacy at the individual level, as well as having a sense of efficacy at the collective level, you know, within that community space, within the school community. And that is really transferable regardless of the particular landscape and what they're experiencing. And this is something too that we highlight within the training as well, in terms of understanding that that's really a superpower of an educator, right? Is that capacity to connect. And there have been a lot of stories that have been coming out about this amazing creativity that educators are doing, not just, you know, within our country, but also internationally, you know, getting out there and finding ways to connect when they find out that their students are missing them or that they're really hurting. And so that's one of the pieces that we speak to within the training. It's kind of coming back to an understanding and realizing that, and then also being able to tap into each other. That's a huge premise about GRIT-4ED, is that we are stronger within these teams, and that when we personally are experiencing something, then we have a network to fall back on. And so I think that's an important piece to lift out. This is definitely about the long haul. And so there's going to be an ebb and flow of that sense of we can do this and we can get through it.
Well, and I appreciate that comment a lot, because I think there's this combination for a lot of teachers, and I know for myself as a faculty member at the university, one of the most important things for me as a teacher is my relationship with my students. And when I feel that in-person connection, there's nothing like it, where you feel like you've made a point, or you're working with the student and the student's grasping something. And not only that, there's a personal side to the learning experience, and that's very much the case when you're talking K through 12. So I think the question I have is, how would you, and this is for all the panelists, how would you recommend somebody that's struggling with feeling disconnected, both within their classroom with their students, but also just disconnected from their colleagues potentially, or feeling isolated? Any suggestions around how to help that type of person? Because I think there's a bunch of people out there that feel that way.
I think, oh, Nicole, were you going to jump in?
No, I was just going to say, I think if you acknowledge that you're feeling that way, chances are your colleagues are feeling a similar way as well. And I think it comes back to taking the time to really ask, how are you really doing? Ask that for yourself, ask that in your colleagues, and take the time to really give space to talk and have that conversation. So if I'm working with Carolyn and I'm noticing that I'm burned out and tired and feeling like I'm just disconnected with everybody, maybe sitting down with Carolyn and saying, I know I'm not doing super great right now. How are you doing? And can we talk about this? And can we take 15, 20, 30 minutes to just be together talking about what's really going on in our lives?
And Nicole, we shared a few stories, and some of the participants shared a few stories of how they've gotten creative when that's hit them, about maybe, you know, doing FaceTime and yoga together, right? During those periods when you can't have any kind of contact. There's also been some really cool use of outdoor space, where some have tried to reach out and just find some ways to get together in those spaces as well. But I think that that's another piece too that is so important, about being able to acknowledge I don't have it. You know, when you talk about teachers feeling like I can't do this and I'm not doing it well, that's a common feeling. I feel for most teachers in the best of times, but now it's like even more so, right? And so getting to the end of the day and saying, I did okay, I'm here, right? And I did good work today, and looking at the next day as a new day and a fresh start. We also talked a bit about that as well.
Yeah, and Dr. Geary, the idea of even before the pandemic, right? We needed to come up with strategies to help our teachers feel valued, especially our teachers, but all of the people who work in the education sector space, because there's a lot of negative narrative around what it means to be a teacher, to be an educator in this K through 12 community. And so this has in some ways heightened and exacerbated that need. I'm hopeful that it will have shined a spotlight on our need to be appreciative of our teachers again. And I do see some of that starting to happen. And I hope that, you know, some of what is coming out of the Institute with tailored kinds of training and activity for individuals who are in this field is going to speak to them individually and collectively as people that we really value in our society. You know, I did want to ask about some of the other trainings real quickly, just because there are many. And so if we could get maybe, Nicole, if you wouldn't mind, you probably have a better perspective on across the board what sort of trainings are available and who's accessing what, and you know what some of the differences and similarities are between the different trainings. That would be helpful if you would share.
Absolutely. As part of our community initiative, we do have two kind of big programs that we run. One is what we call our Trauma Training for Professionals class program that we run through the university. It consists of 2 8-week completely online classes through the university system, through Canvas, in which we talk about what is trauma, what does it do in the body, what does it do in the mind, how does it impact different populations, and what can we do about it. And so the beauty of the class is really in these wonderful discussions and sharing of experiences, and how people have really gotten through their own experiences, and you know how they think about what trauma is and stress, how that impacts the body. So we have those classes. We just started today, Trauma Training 1 or Foundations. It started today. There's still plenty of time to register. So if anybody's watching and is interested in that, you can find out more information on our website, on the NIHR website. And then we'll have another one that starts up in end of March as well. The other program we also offer is a peer support program. And this is a program that we tailor to different organizations who tend to experience a lot of stress and trauma. We tend to think of peer support as a program for police officers and firefighters and EMTs. And while it has done exceptional in those fields, it can also be applied to some of these other areas that experience some pretty significant stress and trauma throughout their life. And that would include schools, right? Schools are not immune to the trauma that's going on around us, as we've clearly seen in the past year. And so peer support teaches how to be that supportive person for your coworkers. We talk a lot about what is mental health, how do you deal with it, how do you have that supportive conversation? And then importantly, how do you get somebody more help if that's what's needed? So we currently run that for several organizations throughout the state, and are happy to expand that if any other organizations are interested in what that might look like.
And so Nicole, one of the questions I would want to pose so people understand is, so we have those programs that you're running, but we also have different GRIT programs. So when somebody comes to our website, let's say grit.uccs.edu, and they look at all the different programs, how do they know? Obviously, for the educators that are on this town hall, they would go to the education one. But what if they have a friend who's running a nonprofit, or a friend who's very involved in a faith community or whatever? What can you describe a little bit of the differences of the different trainings? And all those trainings are free, right?
Absolutely, yes. We currently have 4 tracks that are available with GRIT, and as Dr. Benight just said, they're all free. They're all broken down into 5 one-hour modules or segments that you can watch it at your own pace, and they all come with workbooks that viewers can work through the modules together in the workbook, do some self-reflections. But we have what we call just GRIT or GRIT Community, and this is our basic core track that's available to anyone. If anybody is interested in GRIT and learning what that's like, this is a great one to get started with. In May, Carolyn and I developed GRIT-4ED or GRIT for Educators, which talks about that 3 around me mentality of really supporting your school community or your education community as a team. That one is really great, not only for people in the education field, but also coaches, athletic coaches, and parents, because we do talk about what does stress look like in different age ranges and how can you support and have those conversations in different age ranges. And we also do some role plays with that as well. We developed GRIT Lead, or a GRIT track specifically for leaders in the community and small business owners. And that one talks about how can you support yourself as a leader and also your workforce in this, back and forth transition of brick and mortar work to virtual work. And what does that look like? How do you prioritize safety, and how do you have those kinds of conversations? And then this fall, we launched GRIT for Health with the amazing support of our community that talks about how do we support our healthcare workers? What does stress look like for them? Again, how can you have some of those supportive conversations for those helpers in your life? So you can sign up for any one of them. You can sign up for all of them. But if you go to our website, either at grit.uccs.edu or letstalkgrit.com, you can choose which one kind of fits best for your occupation or fits best for what kind of support you want to provide right now.
That's great. And, one of the things that I think, so people understand the difference between the peer support programming and GRIT, is GRIT is meant to be sort of, I think, for people to get a basic understanding of how to support one another, how to create these 3 around me teams and so forth. Whereas the peer support program is really an infused system that then gets developed within an organization that has an ongoing sort of role in the support and trauma prevention issues that relate to that organization. So it's a much more involved and systemic approach. But GRIT could actually be a nice sort of layer on top of the peer support program, and then the peer support program would be a much more in-depth process, and that's kind of how they're designed. So I think it'd be interesting to talk as a panel about loss. So one of the things that we hear across the community in different areas is the amount of loss that people are experiencing currently, and it's interesting because there's this other sort of operating discussion that's happening around hope and the vaccine and how things are moving forward in that direction, which is fantastic. But on the other side, we see the numbers of deaths going up every day, and we know that families and communities are getting impacted. So I'd like to see what the panel thinks about the effects of these losses and how that may be playing out within the school system and for these folks. Who wants to jump on that one?
All right, I'll give it a shot, Chip. One thing that I think is important for everybody to recognize is while there's the loss of life, foundationally for everyone, there's been a loss of a way of life. And that's already set the stage. Our lives are dramatically changed. We keep talking about how to interact, how to support each other virtually, or virtually. Remember that, it's not the same. as being in person. There's not the energy that exists. Everything requires more planning and intentionality. So even when we say, let's get together and support each other, that means scheduling it and thinking about it and, you know, making sure it fits. So that, you know, or the parents who I talk to, the minute their kids are allowed to go back to school, it's like a world has changed for them. You know, so there's just been this inordinate sense of loss. And also, I think related to that is always occurs in grief, what's the future going to bring? So I think that's there regardless. Then you add on to it friends, family, colleagues that have passed due to COVID or other things that may have been impacted by the pandemic. And you know, that can really throw us for a loop. And that, you know, it's not the same to grieve anymore. You know, grieving virtually is not the same as grieving as a group. Supporting each other and planning for some of the, you know, the issues after somebody's been lost is not the same as it was. So I think the grief is actually more profound because we just are more isolated. And, you know, I'll share a story. You know, we lost a dear colleague in the Department of Psychiatry. And I couldn't hug anybody. Right. So it's very hard. You know, loss is something that we anticipate, we expect, but our methods of dealing with it are so different right now. And I think that has a profound effect.
I also want to add to, just speaking right on that, you know, some of the youth that I've been working with in the past year, there's also this overwhelming feeling of hopelessness because for them, the loss feels very permanent, right? Whereas maybe, you know, as adults, we can kind of rationalize that in a year, things might feel a little bit more to normal. But for a lot of our youth, it feels like what they're feeling now is permanent, is always going to feel that way. You know, I've had conversations with teenagers where they've said, I'm never going to go back to school again. It's never going to be normal again. I'm not going to get to graduate like my friends did last year, right? There's just this sense of this will always be, and having to kind of help them combat that can be a challenge as you're combating some of that sense of helplessness and hopelessness as well.
I think along with that loss, what I'm hearing is a couple of different things as well. Starting to feel numb, and then being worried about feeling numb to it, and then also this fear among teens. You know, is like, when is this going to end? What will be the overall impact? Because everything that has been kind of the normed experience is now gone, right? I have a daughter who's 17, who's graduating this year, and she has no idea what next year is going to look like. So it becomes very difficult for her to now move to that stage of like, this is the next part of my life, right? And that's a huge milestone, and that's gone as well. And so I think that there is that fear piece and that numbness piece that's really difficult, and that it's further it's even more pronounced because, like what you said, we can't hug each other, right? We are living in this virtual environment, so the supports around loss and trauma, we don't have those to fall back on. And so that's very real, and also just the extent and how this keeps going.
And I think the thing that's been quite profound for me is that, like all disasters, there's a lot of writing about this in the literature around disasters have a honeymoon period, and then they sort of break down, and then there's this period of disillusionment and frustration and in some sense a sort of resigning oneself to, I just can't fix anything that's broken in a way. And you know, when it's a hurricane and you look around, and I went through that in Hurricane Andrew, you see destruction everywhere. that's one thing. But in this case, it's like this bizarre, invisible, yet very impactful process. And so it just is a weird coping process, I think, for people. And I think one of the things it does is it exposes the vulnerabilities that were already there. And that's been pretty profound for me, that yet again, the populations that are marginalized, that are vulnerable before the pandemic are even more so now. And I mean, I could predict that from the economic standpoint, which is really hard to watch. But on top of that, it's hitting them stronger just in terms of numbers of cases and numbers of deaths, and from a percentage standpoint. And it's just, it goes on. So it's very hard, I think, to retain a sense of optimism in this kind of frame. But I am one that, you know, I'm the director of a resilience institute. So I do want to shift the, you know, we do have to recognize the pain and the challenges that we're facing. And at the same time, think about, okay, now what? What can we do? And that's what the GRIT-4ED program is for. And what Steve and his colleagues are doing up at Anschutz. There are support systems that have been created knowing that this is going on and that it was coming. And we also want to build on those sort of natural strengths that these schools have, that these teachers have, because I've been around some of these instructors in my life, and I'm just blown away by their dedication, what they do, what they're able to do with students. And so I would love it if people who are on this town hall could put in some examples of their own sort of strengths that they've been able to create or pull from as they're moving through this. There is a way for you to submit some comments. If you could do that, that would be helpful, I think, potentially for others who are on the town hall. So some people will feel a little bit more like they don't have those strengths right now, but some people do. So we want to pull on that a little bit. But I'd like to ask the panelists, you know, because, you know, Carolyn, for example, you've been a professional educator your whole career, and Steve, you've worked in child trauma for your whole career. And so I'm curious how you guys have been able to retain a sense of optimism, because you're both very optimistic people, very realist, but also optimistic. So how have you guys been able to do that? And then if we see some comments come through, we can pull from those too.
I would say, and I was also part of a school community in Kauai when we went through Hurricane Iniki. At that time, it was, you know, it just devastated the island, and it also really hit the economy. But that's when I realized just the strength within the community, the strength within the faculty, as well as the faculty's connection with students was so strong. And things started to happen. And I do believe, like, we see that a lot around us now. It's a matter of noticing it, you know, that things start to happen in terms of reaching out to each other in very kind ways, making sure and checking in, like what Nicole was saying, and making sure that everybody is okay with students and with families, as well as with each other. And it's every time that someone checks in on you, and every time that, you know, you talk to a family or you talk to a student, and you realize you have that connection and you see that impact, I think that also, you know, feeds your soul and gives you, you know, that sense of optimism. When you look around, you know, the challenges have been great for a while in education. And I would definitely say that, you know, for the most part, many educators have at their core, they're able to come back and look at the next day of like, okay, it's going to be different today somehow. Like yesterday may have fallen apart in a lot of different ways, but today is going to be different. And I do feel like that is a core characteristic as well. In maintaining, you know, that optimism. But schools are unique places in terms of just that relational capacity comes into play, and you see that magic happen, and you're still seeing it now. It's just, it's a heavier lift.
definitely.
Well, I think, part of what you just said, Carolyn, is true for anybody who's maintaining any sanity right now, which is doing good work, right? And, so many people, teachers, educators, are doing really good work under ridiculous conditions. And to me, that sense of efficacy, that sense of agency is what gets me through on some of these, harder days, or, 10 hours of Zoom calls or whatever it is. There's one other thing I think is important. I'll be the medical doc for a second. We witnessed a miracle. The fact that there's a vaccine after a year is truly a miracle. I mean, it's unbelievable. So we all know mRNA. I was in med school when mRNA was discovered.
Wow.
Right? And now it's allowed us to have a vaccine in a year. That is amazing. And the 1918 flu lasted 4 years, for God's sakes. We're probably going to get out of this in 2 to 2.5 years. I think that's a real cause for hope. And while it's been really hard, I mean, the understatement of the year, or 2 years, or however long it's going to be, but there are going to be some very positive changes that come out of this. We've learned a lot about what's possible, what might be a combination of platforms and exposures, and how we're going to do that. So I think it could be a really inventive, thrilling time in the future as well.
Well, and one of the side effects that I've noticed too that is really positive has been the sort of family getting outside activities. That I've been blown away by that. I've seen more and more people going outside and moving. And so I think the physical aspect of this has been interesting to watch, and the social connections with families where they didn't usually, the kids would go to school, and this has been really hard on families, of course, but they also have had more time together, which in some cases has been super positive. And then we've also seen some more difficulties with that in terms of domestic violence and other things. So I think it's like anything, this has been a mixed bag. There are definitely some positives. Today, I had a brief break this afternoon and got to run out, take a quick hike with my wife, and because we're both home now all the time. And so, I'm blessed enough that I can work from home, whereas there are a lot of families where that's not the case. So, but I did say on the walk, this is a side effect of COVID that's very positive, is I get more time with her, I get more time outside in a way. So there are some positives with that, and I think we need to hold on to them. But one of the things that we talk about in the GRIT-4ED program is self-care. And I don't want to I actually don't like that term anymore, because I think it should be other care as well as self-care. But self-care gets blown past now. Everybody's used to hearing it. They kind of go, yeah, whatever. But really stopping and thinking about how can I work to increase some balance in my life in some way, and bring some health into my life by whether it's sleeping better. I can tell you, I did a call the other day with some behavioral health providers, and I asked them, how many of you are sleeping okay? Not one of them. And that was a big group. It was like, not huge, but it was like 7, 8 people. Not one of them is sleeping well right now. So this is a challenge. If we're not sleeping well, if we're not eating well, I'm actually drinking a little bit more alcohol than I usually do, which is not too much. I've noticed that. So we have sort of coping strategies that times are not really our best friends. So we got to be thoughtful about that stuff. And so, at least in the GRIT-4ED program, we discuss that a little bit more in depth. So, so to end, I don't know if we don't have any comments or questions. So I'm wondering, Nicole, if you might talk a little bit about some of the resources that, not all of them, of course, but some of the resources that we go into for GRIT-4ED so that people have an idea of what they can get from the training in that context.
Can I just interrupt?
Yes.
One upside
Yeah,
in talking to lots of parents is the appreciation they have for teachers that they didn't have before.
that's awesome.
And I think that's, you know, they never sat in the classroom all the time. They never tried to facilitate, right?
Yeah.
And that's been very interesting. And I hope that appreciation continues, because I think it's just one of the things that it was forced on them and now they get it. You know?
Yeah, exactly.
And I hope that will also translate into parents being more encouraging of their students, children who become post-secondary students who express a desire to go into teaching. Because, you know, we certainly have seen across the country declines in enrollment in educator preparation programs. That fortunately has not been our experience here at UCCS. We have been bucking that trend and have been increasing enrollment in our educator preparation programs. I think part of that is due to the wonderful approach that our faculty have to inclusive educator preparation. And I think it's also a testament to our district partners, who many of whom are alums, many of whom who are part of our education community here in Colorado Springs and El Paso and Teller counties in particular. You know, that they're alums, and so they talk about what it's like to go into education and their alma mater, UCCS. So, but I do hope that as people start to have an appreciation of teachers that is different as a result of the pandemic, that, you know, it will be something that is again seen as a noble profession, as it has been in the past, that we have lost some of that traction and we need to get that back, because we appreciate our educators, our teachers who are there on the front lines of education, as well as our school counselors, our school social workers, our special education directors, our TESOL directors. I mean, the list does really go on and on when you stop and think about all of the different professionals who are in the education community. So I just wanted to respond to that, Dr. Berkowitz, because I thought it was such an important point. And so Nicole, sorry to interrupt there, please, if you would jump in.
No, it was a fantastic interruption. I think it's a wonderful point to make. I think that is a big takeaway of this past year, is parents being, you know, acknowledging, I don't know how to teach my kids, right? And that's why we have teachers. And that's why they're, you know, go into this incredible profession to become helpers. So wonderful interruption. But going back to Dr. Benight's question of what kind of resources are available in the GRIT program. First of all, kind of highlighting on some of the things that were already just said as well. It is important to talk about what are our strengths and what are we already doing well, and what can we be doing a little bit better on, and really reflecting on that for yourself, and then asking the people around you as well in some of those GRIT conversations. So we cover 6 areas of strength, or those areas of quote unquote self-care to look at for yourself and other people. And that includes things like sleep and healthy eating and drinking and relaxation, some of those activities. Importantly, for every one of those 6 areas, we also include an appendix of resources for each of those strengths. So if you're acknowledging, yeah, I'm not sleeping well and I don't know what to do about it, in the workbook that comes with the GRIT tracks, all 4 of them, you'll receive an appendix that has sleep hygiene tips and tricks and things you can do for yourself, and again, to share with other people as well. So we do cover those 6 areas of strength within each of the tracks. We also talk about a basic education foundation on what is stress and what is resilience. How do you talk about it? What does it look like? And then we provide a bunch of different resources for areas of stress and resilience. So that includes online web interventions, including our own myresiliencehelp.com, which we talk about more in depth, some other programs that might be available, 211, which is a great community resource available nationwide. We talk about different websites you can go to, a ton of different apps that are available for wellness, including sleep, meditation, relaxation, exercise, even healthy eating and drinking. So a lot of different apps you can try out. We include things like podcasts and reading material. If this is an area that you'd like to learn more information on, we include those. And then also just links to other websites and articles that talk about resilience and stress and what we can do about that as a community. So really packed in with resources. What we also do in each of the 4 tracks is provide role plays of what a grit conversation might sound like. So oftentimes we take these trainings and we're like, great, now I know what to do and I have no idea how to do it. So we provide that role play so you can hear what that might sound like. We encourage practice within those videos so that you can literally practice it out loud. I often talk about, talk out loud to your dog, because then you can at least hear what it sounds like to ask some of these questions, have a little bit of this conversation. And then we provide self-reflections as well, so you can really reflect on the material and think about how it applies to your own life.
Great. So we did have one question that came through, and I'm wondering if Carolyn, this might be one for you. This was a question that asks about the learning management system, or LMS, that we've kind of taken the approach for GRIT-4ED and through the modules. So, I'm wondering if you could maybe have an answer for that.
So is the question specifically if the modules are on an LMS?
What LMS does GRIT-4ED use for the learning
Okay.
modules?
Okay, so this, Nicole, you can maybe help me out with this as well. But the GRIT-4ED modules actually isn't on an LMS. Really, you can access it through the GRIT website directly, and then you're able to navigate through the whole program that way. And then once you complete the program, then there is a way for you then to receive a certificate for that time that you took to do it, and for the whole training. And so that is something that you can then turn in for your professional development credits.
And go ahead, Nicole.
I was just saying, yep, you have that exactly right. Once you sign up for any of the 4 tracks, you'll receive a link with all of the videos all on one page, as well as the workbook and some surveys and things that we also asked to fill out for research purposes. And then once you complete the training, you can take a quiz. Upon completion of the quiz and passing it, you'll get an automatic certificate of completion. If you email us at grit@uccs.edu, I'm happy to personalize that with your name and when you finished it and how many hours it included.
There was also a question around, is the workbook downloadable?
It is. It's all available as a PDF that you'll get in that link as well. We'd love to be able to actually send this out to everybody, but we live in a virtual world now, so it is downloadable for yourself.
Great. So, I think my pitch to the people who are still in the town hall is, really hope that this discussion today and the training can give you a sense of hope and a sense of optimism that we are going to come through this. It's very dark outside, so it kind of makes me feel like, the darkness that we've had to go through here, and we're going to get to the other side. And this program and the other resources that are available can help us all get there. So I really appreciate people's energy to take the time to do the training and reach out to your colleagues and your families and kids that you're working with and so forth. And Dean, I want to thank you, Dean Connelly, for helping to put this together. And if we can do anything else to support the College of Ed and also the educational community, we're here to try. So thank you for helping us to do that.
Well, thank you, Chip, and thanks to all of our panelists and to our participants. I do hope that you will also spread the word to your colleagues, maybe who were not able to participate this evening, or also, maybe some of those who did participate, and by talking, you find out that you did, that you find a community of support in the access of this information and materials and support that I hope that you all do feel from UCCS, from the UCCS College of Education, and from the National Institute for Human Resilience. So thank you all very much, and I hope you have a wonderful evening.
Good night.